You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating all things Jewish.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, coming to you from our studios at B'nai Zion Foundation in New York. And like everyone else, I have my heroes. I've told this to you before. There's so many people who I look forward to speaking to here when I'm doing L'Chaim on Shalom TV, but there's none I look forward to more than my guest today, because for many, 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 many years, I have respected everything he has done. He is perhaps the most eloquent liberal voice on the American Jewish scene and on the American scene in general. He also has become the quintessential voice defending the state of Israel. And by now, you already all know that I have the great honor of sitting with Alan Dershowitz, who is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard University. Alan also is, I'm sure you know, a prolific writer. By the way, you know, I said to myself, there really must be more than one of you. There is, right? Which one?
That's a problem.
There's got to. Alan, I can't believe how many things you do and how many things you write and how you're everywhere and how, Alan, you're one of those rare human beings who almost never says no when people need you and want you. And
My wife, who's a psychologist, thinks I have a disease called FOMS, F-O-M-S.
What's that?
Fear of missing something. And she insists that I can never say no, and it, sometimes upsets her because I agree to do things and then I say, "Oh, why did I agree to do that?" But I want to correct one point you made. The Jewish tradition, I think, does not allow for heroes. Every hero in the Bible is deeply flawed. Avraham, we know his flaws about how he uses his sister to escape and accepts God's commandment to kill his
wife.
His wife, claiming it's his sister.
Exactly.
And then Moshe, of course, we know is a flawed. David, my God, what a flawed hero. So heroism, it's interesting. It's the difference between the Jewish tradition, the Muslim tradition, and the Christian tradition really can be summarized that way. In Christianity, Jesus is flawless. In Islam, Muhammad is flawless. In Judaism, everybody has flaws, because Judaism is a very human religion.
All right, but even if you have flaws, and I'm sure you do, Alan, you can still be somebody's hero.
Well,
as long as we understand you are a human being.
Just don't raise expectations too high for anybody.
Well, I'm sorry.
Right?
You know what's also true, and again, I have seen this universally to be true for Alan. Sometimes you want to hear somebody, you're looking forward to hearing somebody speak, and they come and they disappoint you. Alan, you've never disappointed, and that is to your credit. And you and I were both at the recent Jerusalem Post conference here in New York, and I was there with my wife, and we both marveled that you are in a room of stars. You were a star in your ability to articulate for the people who were there issues they agreed with you on and issues which they disagree with you on.
Right.
And that's and I'll stop embarrassing you after I say one last thing. One of the things that has been important to me is that you've been willing to bear the slings and arrows from people who disagree with you, and it has never shut you up. And in fact, when you say to people in public settings, I want you to argue with me, I want you to challenge me, Alan, that is a very rare quality, especially in the Jewish community.
Well, let me tell you, though, people take me up on that consistently. Even my talk at the Jerusalem Post, I thought it would be uncontroversial for me to say, please, do not boo the President of the United States. No matter whether a Republican or a Democrat, Israel must always be a bipartisan issue. I got a lot of emails from people saying, why are you shutting us up? We're entitled to boo the President of the United States. I don't think so. You're entitled to disagree. You're entitled to criticize. But booing is just not the appropriate response to a President of the United States, no matter what the party he comes from.
Incidentally, Alan, were you surprised by the extent to which the room at the Jerusalem Post conference seemed to be very much against Obama?
I was, especially since the polls show that Obama will likely get more than 70% of the Jewish vote. Of course, that's irrelevant. The only relevant Jewish vote that matters for Obama is Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, probably those three. It doesn't matter whether he wins 110% or 2% of the New York vote, or 110% or 2% of the California vote. He's going to win those two states. It doesn't matter whether he gets 2% or 3% of the Texas vote. He's going to lose Texas. It's the states that are in contention, particularly Florida, where the Jewish vote really, as we know, can determine the outcome. Look what happened in 2000. The Jewish vote determined the outcome of the presidential election because Jews, by mistake, voted for Pat Buchanan in Palm Beach County. If those votes had gone to the Democratic candidate, the presidency would have been in the hands of the Democrats. For better or worse, I'm not here making a political point, just a point about how important it is to vote and how the Jewish vote can never be taken for granted. It has to be earned every election by every candidate. Nobody should ever be able to say the Jewish vote's on my side, the Jewish vote's on the other side.
It's interesting. On Shalom TV, we have featured Mitt Romney, Rick Santorum, Newt Gingrich, Glenn Beck, Mort Klein, Michelle Bachmann, and I will get emails from viewers who claim that there is no Republican expression on Shalom TV if they see a single liberal Democrat on Shalom TV. And on Shalom TV, we have gone out of our way to really try to have the spectrum of the Jewish community represented. But I am often taken aback by the extent to which there is almost a desire to censor on the Republican right in the Jewish community, because at the moment, the Republican right is seen as being more supportive of the State of Israel than the Democratic left.
Well, you know, it's interesting because historically the Republican right was strongly against Israel. Oil interests, conservative interests, people like Pat Buchanan and others who were virulently anti-Israel. I think what's happened is that the radical left has now taken over as the most virulent anti-Israel force. But the center political left in America is very supportive of Israel. Virtually all the United States senators from the Democratic side are supportive of Israel. Generally Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton, one exception, of course, Jimmy Carter. But we have exceptions on the other side. George Bush I was very anti-Israel. And then you have complicated situations like Richard Nixon, who was a bigot, an anti-Semite, but he supported Israel in the crunch. Maybe a little too little and a little too late in '73, but nonetheless, he supported Israel. The important thing is do not let the political world take anybody for granted. What I worry about with the extreme right in the Orthodox community is they've marginalized themselves. They are so knee-jerk right-wing Republican that nobody has to appeal to them anymore because they know that they're going to vote Republican no matter what. So they're losing their influence. It's very important to always kind of be in the middle and to tell every candidate every day, earn my vote today, not yesterday. Don't tell me what you did yesterday. Tell me what you're doing today and what you're going to do tomorrow.
Has President Obama in any way disappointed you in terms of the policies he has vis-a-vis Israel?
He has, and I've told him that. And he knows that. And I'm not the only person he's disappointed, and I think he understands that he made some mistakes. Going to Cairo and making that speech, I don't know who vetted that speech for him, but going to Cairo, making that speech in which he basically says that Israel grew out of the Holocaust without recognizing Israel's deep roots in Eretz Yisrael for thousands of years. And then in the same sentence, he didn't make comparison, but in the same sentence describing the Nakba and the Shoah was a terrible, terrible mistake. And then not getting in his plane and flying 20 more minutes to Jerusalem and speaking to the Israeli people directly accounts for why his numbers are so low in Israel, and he's not particularly popular in Israel. His numbers are going up now as he has turned the corner on Iran and made some very strong statements about no containment. We will prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. We're taking no options off the table. there's increased support, but he's made mistakes, and he's disappointed me. Another mistake was when he basically said, and it's the way he said it, that the negotiations for his two-state solution have to begin with the 67 borders. Think of the implications of that. It means they begin with the Palestinians holding on to the Kotel, holding on to the access road to Hebrew University, holding on to the Jewish quarter. Then you can negotiate from there. Now, I spoke to Prime Minister Fayyad about that when I was in Israel, and he said, you know, yes, we'll give you the Kotel, but in exchange for 10,000 acres in the Galil, we'll give you the access road. But, you know, because in property, there's only one thing that's important: location, location, location. What could be more important in location than the Kotel, the access road to Hebrew University, and the Jewish quarter? So Israel should not begin its negotiations from the 67 borders. It should first adopt 242 of the UN, which basically says some territorial adjustments can be made. Those include the important strategic areas around Jerusalem, and then begin negotiations. So, yes, I've been disappointed, but not a single president of the United States has ever not disappointed me. I have high expectations. Every prime minister of Israel disappoints me. Everybody disappoints me. You know, the essence of looking for a better world is to be disappointed and to expect better from everybody.
One time I had the pleasure of speaking with you by phone, and you made a very interesting comment. It was almost an aside. You said to the audience, don't ever make a president the enemy. Don't make the president the enemy.
Right.
And this was at a time when, I forget what President Obama had done, and there was an enormous uproar. And I always thought that was an interesting comment, and in some sense, I thought that's what you were trying to say.
I am.
At the Jerusalem Post conference.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say.
And I don't know why everybody didn't say, you know, Alan's making a very important point, whether we're upset, whether we're angry, whether we think he made a mistake. The president is never the enemy. I don't care if he's a Republican president or a Democratic president.
I think that's right. Remember Baker's infamous statement that Ed Koch publicized, where he said, you know, essentially, why do we have to do anything for Israel? The Jews don't vote for us anyway. And he put it a little bit more crudely in some other context. We can never allow either party to be against us. You know, look what's happened in Europe. In many parts of Europe, the right supports Israel and the left doesn't. Everybody's concerned about what will happen in the French election, the Spanish election, British elections. Will Miliband be ever prime minister? Because it's become a right-left issue in many parts of Europe. We don't want that to happen in the United States. And I can tell you, from personal conversations with the Israeli leaders, they don't want that to happen in the United States. They always want Israel to be a bipartisan issue.
What's your reaction right now to the flap in the Jewish community here in America over Peter Beinart's book and his position that basically he thinks American Jewry should be pressuring Israel to take certain, in his mind, more conciliatory steps towards peace with the Palestinians?
He has a right to express his views. They're different from my own views. His book has generally been reviewed negatively and critically. And I don't think his ideas have made an impact.
What's the worst mistake he makes?
The worst mistake he makes is to call for a boycott of the West Bank. I mean, why blame the people who live in areas, Ma'ale Adumim? They're patriots. They're people who moved there because Israel told them to. This is a bigger problem, and the very concept of a boycott or divestment or sanctions play into the hands of Israel haters. So that was a very serious tactical mistake. When even J Street opposes you, you know you've gone too far. I also think that it's not so much the words, it's the music. When you read what he writes, the music suggests a kind of super-critical, hyper-critical attitude toward Israel and a somewhat less critical attitude toward the Palestinians. He doesn't strike an appropriate balance. He's also, I think, wrong about some of the demographic conclusions. I see students all over the country. I speak probably to more college groups than anybody else. There's very strong support for Israel among young people. There's some opposition. One of the big problems is Israel used to be so easy to defend. 67 war, I was a young professor. You beat your chest and you say, wow, we love the Israelis. They're terrific. Look at what they did. Oh, you're a Jew. You're supportive of Israel. That's terrific. Let's have dinner. Today, if you're a supporter of Israel, on many university campuses, you have to spend your time apologizing. It's much more difficult at dinner parties and at conversations and in bull sessions. And so Beinart is on to something when he says it's harder to defend Israel as a young person than it used to be. But I think his solutions are way off base.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that true at Harvard yourself? That there's more criticism of Israel now than there has been in the past?
Harvard is a wonderful place for Israel. I'll give you an example. I'll give you two examples. One, Yasser Arafat dies. Thank God. I called it an untimely death because if he had only died 4 years earlier, we might have real peace. So Arafat dies. The Palestinian students want to put up the Palestinian flag to commemorate his death. Harvard says no, it's not an official flag of any UN recognized country. Who did they come to be their lawyer? Me. So I say, sure, I'll defend your right to put up the Palestinian flag, but you have to defend my right to hand out leaflets telling the truth about Yasser Arafat. That's what happened. So that's Harvard. So a little while ago, some Harvard students wanted to do an event for a one-state solution. The one-state solution obviously means the end of Israel. Everybody knows that. All the people invited were people who hate Israel. And there was a lot of opposition. So people wanted to censor them. I said, no. Let's have a better conference. So a bunch of the students on their own, freshman students, sophomores, convened a conference on what Israel does for the world today. It was so much more successful than the one-state conference. It got more coverage. More people came. Everybody loved it. We won. So we can win this debate. There are always going to be the 10% who hate Israel. There are going to be the 20% who love Israel. And then there's the 70% who you can influence by doing constructive things. And when the 10% do these demonstrations in which Israel's worse than Nazism, they lose. Nobody believes that. That's just total nonsense.
You have taken a consistent position to one degree or another. I want you to clarify it now, that you have been against the settlements that have been established on the West Bank.
Right.
What's your real argument against them?
Well, let me start. 1973, go back very far back, when Israel established its first real civilian religious settlement, I think it was called Elan Moreh. I came out against it. I said, I'm in favor of unilateral annexation by Israel of areas captured in 67 necessary for Israel's defense. That was the Alon plan. Completely in favor of that. Annex it. Don't even negotiate it. You want it in a defensive war. You're entitled to make border changes. I worked closely with Justice Goldberg, who was then at the UN, and I played a minor role, but helped draft some of the language of 242. And that clearly contemplated Israel making border changes unilaterally consistent with its own security. So I always favored that. My fear was putting civilian settlements in there would complicate the issue terribly and would require the confiscation of Arab Palestinian land, and just wasn't the right thing to do. I also thought it would undercut Israel's security. It would make it harder for Israel to defend itself by having so many Israeli soldiers having to defend these areas. Now, I don't mean to suggest that that should apply to areas right outside of Jerusalem. Ma'ale Adumim, Gilo, those are part of Jerusalem, and even the Palestinians agree that they will remain part of Israel no matter what the negotiated solution is. I'm talking about far-flung settlements way out in the West Bank. Now, let me tell you about two areas that are very complicated, and you're right to say the position is not a simple one. Take the Etzion block. That was never Palestinian. That was always Jewish areas. And I think that Israel should hold on to the Etzion block. Hebron, much more complicated, much more difficult. Not part of what was originally to be Israel, but part of the Jewish heritage. I mean, obviously, Hebron, the birthplace of the Jewish people in some ways. That's very complicated because it's also an area with very, very large Arab population, and I think some deal has to be made that results in a Jewish presence remaining in Hebron, a Jewish religious presence, but it could be under the auspices of the Palestinian state. We're smart people. We can figure out condominiums, cooperatives. We can figure out ways. of giving sovereignty to the Palestinians, yet maintaining a clear Jewish presence.
Are settlements illegal?
Some are, some are not.
What makes a settlement illegal?
If you take seriously international law does not permit transfer of populations relating to captured areas, and so you can't move your populations in and other populations out. Any settlements that fit that definition would under international law. Now look, I have to tell you, international law is very confusing. I am not a big fan of international law. International law has really abused any kind of sense of objectivity, and I've read articles by brilliant scholars, including the former dean of the Yale Law School, which make a strong case for the legality of settlements. I think the better argument is that some of the far-flung settlements raise serious legal questions. Having said that, I'm a fan of the settlers themselves, the ones who are in legal settlements. They are doing Israel's work. I was a fan of the settlers who lived in Gaza. They were the pioneers. They were the chalutzim. They were the ones Israel said, do our job. Nobody should condemn them. That's my criticism of Peter Beinart, too. But in the interest of peace, I think it was Rabbi Soloveitchik who once said that even if Israel had to give up some of the holiest places to save human life, is more important. And so from my view, I think we need a two-state solution to help Israel maintain itself as a Jewish democratic state. I think it will help Israel within the international community. By the way, I don't think the settlements are the barrier to peace. They're not only the main barrier, I don't even think they are a major barrier to peace. The major barrier to peace is the unwillingness of the Palestinians to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, to give up its so-called right of return, which is not a right and has nothing to do with people returning. It's the idea of doing away with Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people. So I think those are the major barriers to peace.
Okay. I want to press you a little bit.
Sure.
I don't understand philosophically how you can say some settlements are illegal in your mind, while some are not.
It depends on whether...
They all are created by Israelis
right.
on what was Jordanian-controlled disputed territory up till 67.
To me, the issue is not territory. The issue is people. It's always been people.
Explain it to me.
Do you displace people? Do you make people move off the land? It's the transfer of populations.
Okay, did settlers push Palestinians off of land?
Some. In some instances, yes.
Okay, but what bothers you then is not really the settlement. It's the process by which the settlement was created. The settlement itself is not. In other words, if it turned out that Israelis purchased land from Palestinians, would it bother you if they established a settlement on purchased land?
Well, you say bother. There are legal issues. There are moral issues.
Would you consider it illegal?
Probably not illegal. And, it's complicated because Palestinian law prevents Palestinians from selling land to Israelis. So is it legal? It depends whose law you apply.
But that's certainly not international law.
No. That's certainly not international law. But international law does generally prohibit civilian settlements in areas that are captured. Now, of course, when the United States captured Germany and Japan, we had civilian settlements, but they were not permanent. We had Americans living in Germany and Japan.
But Alan, either they're all illegal under
I don't think so.
Or they're not illegal.
No, I think there's a difference, number one. Under Israeli law, there's certainly a difference. The Israeli Supreme Court has said that Ma'ale Adumim and Gilo are legal and certain other settlements are illegal.
On what basis, Alan?
On the basis of Israeli law. On the basis of Israeli law, on the basis of legislation that has been enacted.
But what did Israel do that was different inside, assuming it was not displacing any Palestinians? What's the difference conceptually between Ma'ale Adumim and Ariel?
Well, Ma'ale Adumim has been annexed as part of, Jerusalem has been annexed to Israel. And so I think the legalities have been, first of all, under Israeli law, they're both legal.
Right.
So let's be clear about that. Under Israeli law, they're both legal, number one. Number two, I do not believe this issue should be resolved as a question of law.
I agree with you.
You have to, even if you have the right sometimes it's right to give up your right
Right.
in exchange for real peace. So I don't want to focus myself on the legality. I can tell you, having read some Supreme Court decisions in Israel, that some settlements are deemed legal under Israeli law, others are deemed illegal. Some international scholars think all settlements are unlawful. Some think some are lawful, some are unlawful. You make a good point that in general, either the concept of settling civilians is a lawful thing or an unlawful thing. But in international law, everything is a matter of
I want to
degree.
express my opinion and see if you're comfortable with
Sure.
it or whether you think I'm making a mistake.
Sure.
I argue that the settlements are neither illegal or immoral. I believe they're unwise. I believe they're unwise because they create a stumbling block. I agree with you, they're not the principal
Right.
issue that is preventing peace, but it gives the Palestinians, and even that's not fair on my part, it's not that it gives the Palestinians. If I give the Palestinian the most credit I possibly can and try to see it from their perspective, they want some kind of symbol from the State of Israel that Israel is serious about making peace with the two-state solution, and that you're not about to start settling a place that you plan on handing over to somebody else. So that for me, it's not about legality, it's not about immorality. I rankle when I hear people call the settlements illegal or immoral. I accept your caveat that if we've displaced people who had property rights, it doesn't matter. But that in general, I see the West Bank as land that was captured from a United Nations mandate for partition plan that was never implemented, that territory didn't belong to anybody, does not belong to the Palestinians, and it doesn't belong at the moment to the State of Israel.
You can make that case, and I certainly agree with your assessment that the practical should trump over the legal.
Yes.
Israel captured the land from Jordan. Jordan is a recognized state. Whether it should have been set up under the mandate or not is a historically interesting question. But Israel captured it from Jordan. It had the right to capture it from Jordan. Jordan started the war. Whoever you might think started the war with Egypt and Syria, that's obviously disputed.
Jordan shot the first
Jordan
shot.
shot the first shot. We know Israel said, if you don't fire that first shot, you can keep the kotel.
Right.
We're not even going to try to capture Jewish Jerusalem. So Jordan waged an aggressive war against Israel. It also fired missiles into civilian areas to start the war in West Jerusalem. So no doubt Israel had the right to capture that land. Then the Jordanians, as you know, tried to, whether they succeeded legally or not, gave that land to the Palestinians and said, whatever rights we have, we now give to you.
When was that?
So that was when Jordan made peace with Israel. Essentially, they made a decision to give all their rights over to the
But this was
Palestinian
after
people.
Israel had already won
Of course.
the West Bank.
Oh, no
Right,
question about
right.
that. Oh, yeah. And look, Jordan didn't want to have anything to do with administering the West Bank, just like Egypt didn't want to have anything to do with administering the Gaza. In fact, the Camp David Accords almost failed because Israel wanted to give Gaza to Egypt, and the Egyptians didn't want it.
All right, one more question on this whole area.
Sure.
We've discussed this before, you and I, that one of the things you've stood for in your entire career is, in general, a liberal approach to how society should try to work out its problems and care for its people.
Right.
And at the same time, suddenly, Alan, if one is, quote, pro-Israel, it is almost as if there is, by definition, the notion that that is not a liberal position to take. And I've heard people say, whether it's, I think Bret Stephens has said it, I think maybe you have said it as well, if you look at the State of Israel, there is no more liberal society in the entire Middle East. But when people criticize the liberal position as for being pro-Israel, it has nothing to do with the internal social structure of the State of Israel. It has to do with what is perceived to be an injustice to an occupied people. And that what bothers the liberal adult as well as young person in the Jewish community is that it seems as if Israel has become a almost brutal oppressor that is willing to place the Palestinians in positions of second-class status, take away their rights of freedom and free movement, has been inconsiderate about water rights as they apply to the
Yeah,
to the
no, I
Palestinians.
understand the argument.
And that it's not about whether Israel is good to gays and women. It's about what Israel does with the Palestinians. I want to know what your answer is.
Well, I don't believe that that's what people believe, because it's total and utter nonsense. The situation of Arabs in Israel and on the West Bank, even on the West Bank, better than Arabs anywhere else in the Middle East. This has not been an oppressive occupation compared to other occupations. Where are the liberals on China, where we see a longer and much more oppressive occupation of Tibet? Try to get a demonstration on a campus in favor of Tibet or the Dalai Lama. You can't get it. It won't happen. Try to get a demonstration on campus in favor of the poor people of Syria who are being murdered. It won't happen. These are excuses. These are justifications being offered, for the most part, by people who hate Israel, for the most part by many, many Jews who have terrible problems with their own Jewish identity as Jews. Let's just apply a single standard to Israel. There's plenty to criticize, but apply a single standard. If you apply a single standard, Israel is one of the best in terms of human rights. In fact, I would make this challenge. Has any country in history ever killed fewer civilians than Israel has, faced with comparable threats? The answer is no. Israel has killed far fewer civilians than any other country in the world in any comparable war. Has any country ever applied a higher standard of human rights faced with comparable threats? No. So I take on the issue directly, the Palestinians. I agree with you. How Israel treats its gay populations in Tel Aviv bears no relation to how, only bears minor relation. What happens to gays in Palestine is they seek asylum and try to move to Tel Aviv, because that's where they can have complete freedom. And so I take the issue on directly. Do I think Israel deserves an A+ in the way it's treated the Palestinians? No. It's
what grade?
About a B-. But in a world, even with great inflation, a B- is so much higher than almost any other country. And consider the threats that Israel faces. It built a security barrier. That security barrier has saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. Did it do it by compromising with the rights of some Palestinians? Yes. Is it inconvenient for Palestinians to have to stand at the checkpoint? Yes, but it's also inconvenient for Israelis every single day. When they go into a shopping mall or going to a theater, they have to be searched. They have to worry about their kids going on buses. It's an inconvenient place because of terrorism. And the fact that Israel has to take some actions to reduce terrorism, when on college campuses you have these checkpoints that they set up. What I urge the students to do is, in addition to having the checkpoints, also have people being fake blown up in the middle of pizza parlors or in the middle of, walking with their children. Let the people understand this is a complicated issue. If terrorism would have stopped, if the Palestinians were to sit down and negotiate a two-state solution, these problems would be eliminated.
Did you see the 60-minute piece Bob Simon did that was sort of suggesting Israel's responsible for a diminishing Christian population?
Well, I've read the transcript. I haven't seen the piece, but it's, of course, such George Orwellian reversal of truth. I mean, Israel's the only country where Christianity is thriving. Christian churches are being built. Christians in Israel are first-class citizens. Christians are exiting the Gaza practically without exception. Lebanon is hell for Christians today. Egypt is miserable for Christians today. The West Bank is very difficult. So turning the story on its head, but 60 Minutes historically has been the most dishonest show on television. It gets high ratings, but it's thoroughly dishonest. Let me give you an example of what 60 Minutes did to me once. People know my positions on torture. I'm unalterably opposed under all circumstances to the use of torture, but I know it will happen, so I favor a torture warrant. That is, you shouldn't ever be allowed to use torture without getting authorization, justification from a court, though I'm opposed to torture. Mike Wallace, who is my friend, asked me for an interview on my views on torture. I say, Mike, you're going to be disappointed. I'm against torture. For several hours he sits with me and says, but Alan, you'd be favorable torture in the following situation, right? No. Ticking bomb? No. I'm not in favor of torture.
Even
I'm
a ticking bomb?
Even ticking bomb. I'm against the use of torture. Let me finish my story first, and then we can object. So I'm against the use of torture. So for several hours I say I'm against torture, I'm against torture, I'm in favor of torture warrants, I'm against torture, just like I'm against the death penalty, but I'm in favor of warrants before you can execute somebody. All right, he does the interview, he's disappointed. The show begins. Mike Wallace gets on and says, "You'll never believe what liberal favors torture." Doesn't have me saying it, but he says it. So I call him, I say, "Mike, how can you do that?" He said, "Well, that wasn't really part of the show. That was just the lead-in to the show. That isn't covered by the same kind of journalistic ethics." That's typical of 60 Minutes. They use the cutting floor, the edits, to turn black into white, day into night, A into B. It's the most thoroughly dishonest show on television. It has been from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. I want you to help me now. I've heard you say before you would give Israel a B-.
That's right.
And you've said things like, but if you look at, if it's compared to anybody else, nobody even gets a B-.
That's right.
What does Israel do in your mind that would lower your grade on human rights to the B- level?
What Israel does
Or fails to do.
Or fails to do is during its war in Lebanon, it used cluster bombs and left some behind. That has too high a risk of civilian casualties in my mind. I think it has not been careful enough in its use of some other armaments, even in the Gaza, the white phosphorus. I've been somewhat critical of Israel's actions. Its overuse of administrative detention. It should give more trials, and fewer people should be held for long periods of time under administrative detention. Those are the main points, I think, that I would be critical of. Sometimes it overuses censorship, although that hasn't really had much of an effect because journalists have figured out a way of circumventing Israel's censorship. They just feed the story to the London Times. London Times publishes it, then Haaretz publishes it.
Are you critical of any of their human rights behavior on the West Bank vis-a-vis Palestinians?
Oh, in individual cases, one certainly hears of situations. That photograph the other day of an Israeli soldier butting a protester in the head with a gun. But every country has that. That's why the United States probably gets only a C+. It's been less careful with its use of drones and targeted killings than Israel has. Look, I'd like to see every country raise their level. When I give my students exams, the first exam I usually grade a little lower because I want them to have something to aspire to. So I would hope that both Israel and the United States could increase their grades a couple of notches. No country will ever be perfect when it comes to human rights.
Okay. And do you feel it's necessary for Alan Dershowitz to be saying these things all the time? These things being, it's not simple. If somebody says to you, "My problem with you, Alan, is that I don't hear you publicly talking about the things that bother you," even if we both say, and I agree with you 100%, no country is perfect. But at the same time, we want Israel to be the best it can possibly be.
Right.
And those on the left who are taking what is now a more liberal stand are arguing that Israel is not being just enough, and they want Alan Dershowitz to say so.
I get it from both sides. I get the people from the left saying, "I'm not critical enough of Israel." I get people on the right saying, "I'm far too critical of Israel." I call it the way I see it. I try very hard to be as critical of Israel as I am of the United States. Look, I'm very critical of what the United States has done at Guantanamo. I think it was a terrible mistake, and I'm disappointed with Obama for not having just simply closed down Guantanamo. I can't not be critical when I see areas where I think improvement is necessary. But what I try to do is make my criticism constructive, make it positive, make it loving. Nobody can call me a hater of Israel, even though when I'm critical of Israel. And I will defend Israel, as I previously mentioned, defend Israel even if I disagree with it, if I think it's acted reasonably, lawfully, and with a good faith effort to protect its civilians from terrorism.
And doesn't it do that virtually all the time?
Yes, I think it does that virtually all the time, and therefore I defend Israel virtually all the time. There are some exceptions.
You are, as I said, you have written both fiction and nonfiction. How many books have you done now?
30.
30. Do you literally write them yourself, or you have people help you write them?
Oh, no, I write every single word. I'm so jealous of my writing. I write every word by hand. I write every single day on...
You write every day?
Every day. I write about 1 million words a year. And so that's about 4,000 words a day. So I don't feel like...
Do you need to write, Alan?
I do. I don't feel like my day is complete unless I have sent off my 20 or 30 handwritten pages to my secretary, who then types it and sends it back to me, and I edit. But I write all of my own, my 3 novels I wrote, and my 27 other books.
Do you experience emotional anxiety over the fact that there isn't enough time to do everything you want to do?
Yes. But, I also, like last night, I went to see an opera from 6 to 11:30 at night. I love theater. I love opera. I refuse to allow myself to become all work, no play. I love to walk on the beach, so I try to live a fairly full life. I have, 3 children, 2 grandchildren, spend a lot of time with them. But I wish there was more time. I wish there was more time.
It's amazing.
I'm efficient. I tell you, I don't mutcher a lot. I'm efficient. I get things done.
Okay. I want to talk to you about law.
Sure.
I'm going to set it up, and then I've been so happy that I get a chance to ask you this question. You'll correct me if I get it wrong in context, but my sense is that at one point, middle 50s through the end of the 60s, when we had the Warren Court, there was a certain celebration, it seems, over the fact that the Warren Court was an activist Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And by activism, those of us who were so pleased with the direction of the court, what we meant by that was that it was within what we considered to be the rules of the game, within the rules of the Constitution.
Right.
It was at the same time trying to help shape the destiny in the future and the style of this American experiment.
Right.
And that whether it was the Civil Rights Act, whether it was creating the principle or expounding the principle of privacy, which led to Roe v. Wade, whether it was Miranda rights, that somehow the court was taking a role that was appropriate in the broad social structure and legal structure of the United States.
Right.
And I want to understand whether people who look, for example, at the Supreme Court's decision in the 2000 election, where basically they said, yes, we are going to answer the question as to whether how the Florida count should go in the Bush-Gore election. Or right now, the discussion, Alan, is over whether the Supreme Court has a right to evaluate the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act of President Obama, what is popularly called Obamacare. And there are some people now who are saying, even the president, was critical of the Supreme Court in a phrase that hurt my ear when he said that he doesn't know whether the Supreme Court should be an activist court, that somehow he was critical of that.
Yeah.
And I want you to give me some perspective as to what did we mean when we applied it to the Warren Court? Is this an issue of whose ox is being gored, or is there something that you can show us about the evolution and the dynamic of the Supreme Court as it applied from the days even before the Warren Court?
Right.
But I'm only taking you from the Warren Court to today in terms of what does it mean to say there is an activist Supreme Court?
Okay, I was a law clerk to Justice Goldberg, who was one of the most activist justices. He was only on the court for 3 years. There is an enormous difference. The Warren Court was activist on behalf of people who had no power, who had no vote. They required reapportionment. They supported the rights of blacks who couldn't affect their own destiny in the South because they couldn't vote in the South. That was what they were doing. They were speaking on behalf of the disenfranchised. That was part of the role of the Supreme Court. They're not popularly elected. They don't have to worry about what the people will think. They were there on behalf of the downtrodden, the unrepresented, the people who had no voice in government. Today's Supreme Court always rules in favor of the big corporations, the big political parties, ruling against people's welfare. It's a statist court, always rules in favor of the state and the large institution rather than the downtrodden. Now, corporations and the others already have access to the presidency and the Congress and the administrative agencies. So there's a big difference. The activist court today is a bully court. It just piles on. When the popular branches don't help the downtrodden, it piles on. Whereas the Supreme Court under Warren played a very different role. It said, who doesn't have power? We're going to speak out on their behalf. That's one difference. The second difference is the Warren court was not politically partisan. Look at who Warren was. He was appointed by the Republicans. Who else was on the court? Brennan, appointed by the Republicans. Today you can predict the outcome of votes depending on who appointed the justices. You get 5-4 decisions, 5 Republicans versus 4 Democrats. The 5 Republicans vote in favor of the Republican candidate for president. The 5 Republicans vote in favor of letting corporations contribute enormous amounts of money. Who benefits from that? The Republicans. The fear is 5 Republicans will vote to strike down the Democratic health care proposal. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but that's the fear. So we've had 2 changes. One, the partisan nature of the Supreme Court, predicting the outcome based on who appointed people, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. It's not what courts should be doing. And second, courts should be speaking up on behalf of the unrepresented, on aliens who don't have the right to vote, on criminal defendants who don't have access to the legal justice system. That's the big difference. And it's a principal difference.
Okay. And so be patient with me. My immediate reaction, of course, is that I understand, and you express it so wonderfully in terms of what I would love to see every branch of government do, represent those who need to be represented and to speak out for the orphan and the widow.
But with lobbying, how do you expect that? You can lobby the executive, you can lobby the legislative, you can lobby the administrative, you can't lobby the courts.
Okay. But I wanted a process answer from you. I understand content, and I understand that this court is radically different in orientation and philosophy, and it is a 5-4 split.
Right.
But I remember times when, in history, Franklin Roosevelt was going to pack the court. It turns out he didn't have to because of certain people dying and leaving. But that one of the things that I have always argued, and I've heard you say it too, is that one of the things one should keep in consideration when one decides whom one's going to vote for president is the president gets to choose members of the Supreme Court. And if you choose a president with a philosophy, don't be surprised if he chooses Supreme Court justices when there's an opening that reflects his philosophy. And so for me, there's always been a partisan quality to the Supreme Court. At the moment, the court is 5-4 in a certain direction. If it were 5-4 in the other direction, then maybe Al Gore would be the President of the United States, would have become the President of the United States, and there may have been many more decisions that you, Alan Dershowitz, are comfortable with. But I'm asking you about process.
Well,
Is the process different? Or in fact, there are those who argue the strict construction as opposed to loose construction. I believe, if you know the Jewish tradition, how the Talmud works, everything is an interpretation.
Of course, everything is interpretation.
Okay, so lo and behold, I accept the notion that when people say to me, no, I'm a strict constructionist, they're interpreting it their way. But I'm asking you, is there something? Is it just that I'm upset with the decisions that are made, or is the process different today?
I think the process is very different. First of all, the process of appointment is very different. In the old days, or when Herbert Hoover had to make an appointment to the Supreme Court, he asked his Attorney General to give him a list. And on the bottom of the list was a liberal Democrat named Benjamin Cardozo. And Hoover said, it's a great list, but you have it upside down. I want to appoint the most qualified judge in the United States to the Supreme Court without regard to his political party or his views. And he appointed Cardozo to the Supreme Court. When Brandeis was appointed to the Supreme Court, similarly, there was a lot of opposition. He and Wilson didn't agree on everything. Today, particularly after the appointment of Justice Souter, who was called the stealth appointment, you can't get an appointment to the Supreme Court unless you've been vetted thoroughly by your positions and unless you've essentially promised, or unless you lie, the way Clarence Thomas lied when he said, I never heard of abortion, I never thought of abortion, or even, Justice, the Chief Justice Roberts, who I like very much, who said, I just call balls and strikes. That's not what justices do. You don't just call balls and strikes. Your ideology plays a major role. So the process, it may have started with Bork, it may have started with Souter, the process by which people get vetted for the Supreme Court has changed dramatically. I also think that the process issue on activism has been confused. I think that it started even with the Warren or the post-Warren court. Roe versus Wade was a disaster for America. I totally oppose Roe versus Wade.
Explain why.
I support a woman's right to choose. I think that abortion is a very important issue, and that I was brought up with the tradition. If I were a Catholic who believed that human life began at conception, I might have a different view. But I was brought up in the Jewish tradition where, life really begins at birth or upon graduation from medical school, depending on how you define it. But life doesn't really begin at conception. That was a hotly debated political issue. There's no right or wrong on abortion. Not only that, but women constitute 51%. They're not a disadvantaged or disenfranchised minority in America. That issue should have been left to the political branches of government. Roe versus Wade is the precursor, in my view, to the conservative judicial activism that we've seen. It also
That's
destroyed,
a very courageous thing for you to say, Alan.
Well, it's not courageous. It also destroyed the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party. When abortion was a political issue, you always had Republicans who supported a woman's right to choose. Once that issue got relegated to the Supreme Court, you get people like George Bush Sr. who changed this view from pro-choice to pro-life, Reagan from pro-choice to pro-life, and many others like that. So it had an enormous impact on the political scene in America, almost all bad. And that doesn't mean I want to see Roe versus Wade overruled. Once you have a decision, there are certain expectations that result from it. But had I been a justice in 1973, I would not have voted for Roe versus Wade. As a legislator, I would have voted for a woman's right to choose abortion.
Yes, but I think what you're saying is you would have said it shouldn't be brought to the Supreme Court.
That's right. I was actually opposed to the ACLU bringing abortion cases to the United States Supreme Court. I wanted them to fight in the legislatures and win the way the fight was being won in almost every state and all over Europe.
Alan, do you believe the Supreme Court had the right to rule in the Florida case in the 2000 election?
No, absolutely not. Certainly had no right to stay the counting. That was a pure, crass political decision. Let me tell you a story. Somebody called me who was married whose child was married to the child of a Republican operative in Arizona. They were having Thanksgiving dinner together with their machatunim. In the middle of the dinner, Sandra Day O'Connor called this guy who was the head of one of the heads of the Republican Party in Arizona, and the guy came back to the dinner with the family with his fingers up like this in victory and said, Sandra just called me and told me it's all set. We figured out a way of doing it. These justices just voted twice. They voted once on Election Day, and then they voted a couple of months later to make sure that their vote on Election Day became the vote of the land. I don't know who would have won the election if it had been fairly counted. You can't tell. I know that the majority, not even a close, but a substantial majority of Floridians intended to vote for Gore. 6,000 or so had ballots that were mismarked because of the butterfly ballot. Others were kept from voting at the polls. But I don't know what a recount would have done. But the Supreme Court never, ever should have been in that case.
Should the Supreme Court have the right now to review the Affordable Care Act?
Certain aspects of it. For example, if you're a Christian Scientist and you'll never use the hospitals and you would make a commitment not to use the hospitals, you can make an argument that a person like that has the right not to be compelled to take medical insurance. There might be religious exceptions. In general, the law is constitutional, certainly under the Commerce Clause. Clearly, medicine is commercial. I mean, I live in Florida part of the year. I have to use medical facilities down there. I'm in New York. I've had to use medical facilities here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, particularly the elderly. Everywhere we travel, we need to have health care. Medicaid and Medicare clearly are national, so I think health care is a national problem.
Are you saying, yes, the Supreme Court has the right?
They have.
Is it appropriate for the issue of affordable health care? Should that be an issue that the Supreme Court should listen to?
It should, and it's an easy case under the Commerce Clause. Under the Commerce Clause, it should be 9-0 that the Supreme Court has the authority to regulate health care. There might be some exceptions that are required under the Constitution for people who shouldn't have to buy insurance.
Are you worried now that this Supreme Court will strike it down?
I'm not sure. I can't predict the outcome of any case, but of course I'm worried. I have friends who have children who are uninsurable because they've had prior medical problems or have limits on their insurance. I want to see all Americans protected in their health care. I also always want to make sure that we have the option of not using the health care. I want to make sure that I have the right to use my own money to get a doctor who's outside the system, unlike in some parts of the world. So I think this health care bill generally should be upheld.
Mm-hmm. And did they make a mistake when they said everybody has to buy it?
I think they should have had a provision in there with some opt-outs, but it's very hard. No emergency room is going to turn down somebody who doesn't have insurance. Look, I'm in favor of everybody having a card that they carry around with them, whether they're an organ donor. And if you're not an organ donor, I think you get to the bottom of the list of organ recipients. Israel has now moved in that direction. Fortunately, thanks to the incredibly brilliant work of Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who went to Israel after his son tragically died and gave all the organs of his son to save lives of Palestinians, of Christians, of Jews, and made it clear that halachically there is an obligation to be a donor because there had been some who had taken a different view. And the idea that you can receive but not give organs is an entirely immoral view. So I don't know how we've gotten from Iran to organ donation, but you're a terrific questioner, so you've managed to cover everything.
I said to you at the beginning, I always look forward to meeting with you, but I don't know how you do it. And I wanted to know whether this is, Alan Dershowitz number 1 or number 50, because as I've said also, you have never said no to me, and it has been my good fortune that I've had the chance to
Well, you're
share.
You're a great interrogator. You really are. I mean, you're really asked me always the hardest questions. So I appreciate it.
It's a privilege to have you on. I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha. There is no one who is doing what you're doing as well as you're doing it. You will always have a place here.
Thank
and
you.
if there's anything I can ever do for you, I can. But my friend, kol tuv v'hatzlacha, thank you very, very much.
Good. Be well.
Alan Dershowitz, as always. You'll agree with some of the things he said. You'll disagree, I am sure, passionately. If you want to be in touch with Alan, just email me, and I will forward your emails on to him. And I very much would love to hear anything you have to say to him or me about this discussion. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. My thanks to B'nai Zion Foundation for giving us some space to do this interview with Alan Dershowitz. They are wonderful to us. And of course, my thanks to you for being part of the Shalom TV L'Chaim community. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, Please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.